get started with this managed aquifer recharge research. I'm actually a surface water hydrologist, so I've always worked in areas where we have rather plenty of water. So coming from Germany, I also did my PhD at Cornell, which is a rather humid, temperate climate. I've worked in northern Sweden. And then when I started my position here at UC Davis, moving to a semi-arid climate, I spent more or less the first year learning just about all the water problems and ongoing research that we have here in California. And groundwater overdraft was quickly a topic that was rising to the top, particularly when I started 2013. We were just in the second year of this extended 4-year drought. It turned out to be a 4-year drought. And farmers were quickly realizing surface water supply dwindled. Everyone was going towards groundwater. And in 2014, the state legislature of California passed this new law, which is called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which basically required more conscious management of groundwater reserves. Meaning they had the plan to bring groundwater basins back into balance, so continued dropping groundwater levels or loss of groundwater storage was not supported. And so everyone has now 20 years of time to hopefully find a way of how we can, develop a sustainable groundwater use that is not causing further depletion. And a big portion of potentially becoming even is to intentionally put more water into groundwater aquifers. Because of the climate, again, that we have in California, it's a fairly flashy climate. So sometimes you have years with very little precipitation, but once in a while we get these really wet years, like we had one in 2017, where we almost got double the annual precipitation of what we typically get. And then we see major flooding. And flooding actually still is the more costly natural hazard that we have in the state of California. So there's multiple interests that are coming together. Better manage flood flows when they are occurring, reduce damage from flooding, but then, utilize that water that we see in those rare wet years to hopefully put that away and store it for dry periods when they come around again. So that is more or less the motivation behind this managed aquifer recharge research. And because California is so big, we're talking about huge amounts of water that we are using. And you can't really use any of the traditional methods. There have been articles, I think, in the news, like capture more water out of the atmosphere, basically collect the water vapor that's in the atmosphere. It would cost billions of dollars to do this with technology. You would have to run, you would have to come up with the energy to even do this. So we really can only use the water that we have available when it is available and figure out ways of how we better manage that water when it is available. And surface reservoirs, of course, have been traditionally the go-to method. They are there to capture winter flows to protect us from downstream flooding. But again, with climate change, we're looking at more extreme precipitation events when they are occurring, which raises the question, are these reservoirs then actually even able to store all these, flood flows that are coming in? And at the same time, we have more drought years, we have higher water demand. So there is more demand on water overall. So, the storage we have in reservoirs is limited, it's finite, and it typically doesn't really last more than 2 or 3 years if you're going into a drought period, as you can see right now in California. So longer term storage of water really can only happen if we put that water underground. And people should remember 97% of the fresh water that we have on land is actually stored in groundwater. It's not in surface reservoirs. So why not make use of that natural storage principle that, nature has been using for millions of years.
Mm. Cool, thanks for the overview. So how much of California's water supply is from groundwater?
Yeah, it's on average, I think long-term average is around 40%. If you look sort of at the last 100 years, but it really varies regionally. So we have this rather drastic precipitation gradient across the state. In the northern part of California, where we are closer to Oregon, we get a lot more precipitation, typically somewhere between 20 and 40 inches a year. The southern part is really dry, desert-like, where you get maybe an inch or two sometimes, in the Mojave Desert, Palm Springs. So in those areas, communities and agriculture rely a lot more on groundwater and have basically used more groundwater on an annual basis than what has been replenished from precipitation naturally every year. So for example, Bakersfield has a precipitation of around 5 to 7 inches a year. Now, if you're growing a crop, almonds, pistachios, walnuts, you typically need 48 inches, 52 inches of water to irrigate that crop. So do the number comparison, right? So if you only get 7 inches in and you assume all of that water actually goes into storage, into groundwater, we're definitely taking more water out than what we're putting in. Of course, not considering that some of the mountains we have on the east side, Sierra Nevada mountains, get more precipitation, and there is some water, of course, going into the valley from there. But yeah, in some communities, you're looking at 60, 80, or even 100% groundwater use because they don't really have any access to the surface water supplies.
And how does rain become groundwater? Where does it seeping in? Is there specific spots in the area?
Yeah, I mean, that is really the process that we can mimic so easily if we were to do this artificially. So precipitation, of course, when it comes in, it typically falls over a very large area. And then typically you do see that precipitation hit the ground surface, depending on what soil characteristics you have. So if it's more sandy soil, typically that precipitation has a very easy time to infiltrate into that soil. And once it's subsurface in the soil, there's a pretty good chance it will move deeper, particularly in a flat area like the Central Valley. There's only one way to go, and that is down. In the mountains, if you have precipitation falling onto hills that are rather steep, often we have also shallower soils on those hills. So meaning you have a little bit of soil and then there might be bedrock underneath. Often that water then would infiltrate, but then move laterally downhill. And sometimes it goes through cracks towards groundwater, but often enough it resurfaces and might, become runoff that then accumulates in rivers and creeks that are taking that water downhill. But for the most part, that would be the natural recharge process. In the Central Valley, though, because we have so much irrigated agriculture, irrigation is actually also a large source of recharge to groundwater. Particularly if you are irrigating crops with like flood irrigation, meaning you kind of open a valve and fairly large amount of water is flowing out, and it's like flowing sort of as a sheet of water over the surface of the field and then infiltrates. In those cases, you can have actually pretty good amounts of that water also moving outside of the root zone where plants might be able to take up that water, and then it goes further down towards the groundwater.
So yeah, so you've been working with farms to kind of help them recharge. So is this a voluntary process that the farms ask you to do, or you ask them, or how does this work to use the farms for recharging?
Yeah, so when I started with the research, I was actually contacting some of our University of California cooperative extension specialists. These are people that work for the university but are connected well to communities. They work with farmers or, residential people. And so I reached out to some of these extension farm advisors, as we call them, and asked if they could help me connect to some farmers who might be willing to try this practice on their land. And at the beginning, we saw a lot of resistance, or, really just like question marks from some farmers. But then we did find a couple farmers who were supportive of that idea, because they have been seeing dropping water tables below their feet, that are dropping 1 or 2 feet per year, and they knew that this would be an unsustainable trajectory. So they said, yeah, I think, I can see how this is working, and if this is putting more water underground that I can then later use and pump out for irrigation, I'm happy to try this. And so we've worked with for example, Don Cameron. He's the general manager of Terra Nova Ranch in the Central Valley, southeast of Fresno. And he has now actually really built out a large infrastructure system on his farm at the cost of around $12 million. So he can pump flood water when it's available onto his farm fields to let it infiltrate into the ground. And we're looking at several thousand so-called acre feet that we use as volume units. So it's an acre in area and then a foot of water height that you might be able to put on that field. So he's, looking at recharging 6, 10, 20 feet of water on an acre if he can. If water is available. And yeah, and we are looking for, of course, always occasions where we have really high infiltration rates. So this is a practice that doesn't necessarily work on clay soils that are fairly tight textured, where infiltration rates are very slow. You can still do it on those soils, but it just, doesn't yield as much recharge as, let's say, doing this on a nice sandy soil.
So if you do it on more clay soil, what happens to the water when you try to recharge it?
Yeah, it just like sits there on the surface, ponded, and you would just have to wait a fairly long time until it really goes into the soil. We have rice fields here in the Central Valley where we actually have those fairly high clay content soils. And well, you can pond water, and you need ponded water for growing rice for that reason. So this is why we wouldn't necessarily pick those soils as ideal recharge locations. But because of the sedimentation history that we had here in the Central Valley, so the Central Valley is basically a big bathtub filled with different types of sediment. They're really ranging in grain size all the way from clay to sands and gravels. Depending on how rivers have brought in these sediments and where they have been deposited. So what we've seen is that particularly on these alluvial fans that are coming out from the Sierra Nevada mountains, like all the major tributaries that are coming from the mountains have been bringing in fairly coarse textured or coarse grained sediment. So sometimes you find gravel pits are a good indication. Well, those are coarse sediments that have been deposited in those locations, and those would be great sites to do recharge.
So how does it work, the whole recharge? So in the winter, is it when there's more rain that you open the reservoir and you allow the water from the river to flow into the farm, or how does it work exactly? Yeah,
so because of our climate, most of the rainfall falls in the winter months, so somewhere between November and May. And that would be the time period that we would be interested in doing the recharge. And you can use different sources. So you could really just divert flood flows as they are occurring in rivers. And even though you have a river that has a reservoir on it, typically even below the river, without any reservoir releases, you would have water that is, accumulating from the landscape, we could divert that water using existing surface water conveyance infrastructure like canals, ditches that we have already in the Central Valley to move irrigation water around during the growing season. So using the same infrastructure in the winter would potentially allow us to move water from rivers or canals onto farmland to have it then infiltrate. There are some water quality issues like sediment. So often we actually don't like to take the water necessarily when we see a rise in stream flow, because often, higher stream flow means that often also a channel, the flows are eroding sediment in the channel, which could potentially, clog your recharge site. But right now, I think there's a large interest to really combine this practice with the surface reservoirs and look at reservoir reoperation and basically let the reservoirs capture the flood flows and then make slow releases from the reservoirs to recharge sites that would then also allow us to release the water at the rate at which we can infiltrate it at the site.
So some of those natural winter flows, is that river just, where was that water to go if you don't flood the farms? Is it just naturally go back out to the ocean? Is that what happens to the water?
Yeah, typically if it's not stored or cannot be stored in the reservoir because they only have a limited so-called flood pool, as we call it, because the main purpose of the reservoir is to capture the water and store it for the summer season. But you never know how big a storm is coming in, how much flow you get from that. So sometimes you have to make releases. And then again, precipitation also falls on the land area below the reservoir. So we typically have actually flooding that can occur even in the Central Valley with reservoirs being there. And yeah, so either it's flooded, land is flooded, particularly in the floodplains adjacent to major rivers. Some of it would infiltrate and go to groundwater recharge, but the majority probably would just flow out to the ocean. And
So,
we definitely want to have some of that flow go out to the ocean because we need it for environmental flows, for maintaining aquatic species in our rivers. But sometimes we just get so much flow that, diverting a little bit would definitely help.
So would you say, like, compared to like California, like 1800 or so, like the total water on California in the soil and in the groundwater, are we losing water to the ocean? Because it used to be that a lot more of that water would naturally go into the groundwater, but now a lot more flows out to the ocean. Is that true? Is that a true?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because before we had reservoirs, all of these rivers would be flooding in the spring, or in the winter season when you had these rainfall events. And then we also, of course, have big flows following the snow melt. So I mean, the 1862 famous flood event that California experienced, according to estimates, about a quarter of the surface area of the Central Valley was underwater at that time. And that would definitely induce quite a bit of groundwater recharge. And, history has shown the water table was much closer to the surface at that time. And we even had areas in the Central Valley where we had artesian groundwater, meaning it was under so much pressure that if you poked a straw into the subsurface, water would be squirting out. Unfortunately, all of that more or less has gone, and water tables are so far below the land surface that even rivers are not connected to the groundwater any longer. So I would, we still get some recharge from flooding rivers, but the events are just so rare. Maybe once or twice every 10 years you get one of those years where you see major flooding. So we definitely lost that recharge process, but again, we gained recharge from irrigating land. And that number is a little bit fuzzy, because we also see a change in irrigation technology happening. So the so-called gravity methods of irrigation, where you just open the flood valve, you let the water flow over the land, it runs down a slight slope over your field. Those are more and more going away because they're called inefficient, but the inefficiency is the portion of the irrigation water that is going to groundwater. And now with switching to drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, yes, you might reduce a little bit evaporation losses to the atmosphere by not wetting your soil surface. But the water that the plant still needs for growing is not changing and is actually increasing because of climate warming. So to some respect, we are now reducing the amount of recharge that we get from irrigation, but I don't think we have a good idea of how much.
Mm. Do the farms use something called tile drainage, where they so when the soil gets too wet, they're just pulling out the water?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have some areas, but not many in the Central Valley where we have that. So mainly around the Delta. So the San Joaquin, Sacramento River Delta that, goes into the San Francisco Bay, because of the high groundwater table. So this is where, ocean meets land. And so you often have a fairly high groundwater table to the land surface. So in those areas, we have to use drain tiles to remove some of the water from the root zone. But for the most part, the other areas, water table typically is well below land surface.
Hmm. And then someone like Don Cameron and other farmers who want to do this, which kind of farms are okay? Like which farm, if you flood like you're saying it's 6 feet high or something with water, which kind of farms will destroy the crops and which ones are okay? Like are all trees okay if you flood them that high, or do some trees get damaged if you flood it that high?
Yeah, a lot of the research on that is still outstanding. I would say we have to gather more data, but Don Cameron basically said, well, I don't really have, so he doesn't have access to surface water as like an irrigation supply source. He is not affiliated with a surface water district that would deliver water to him. He only pumps groundwater. So, he has a large interest to worry about his groundwater source because it's the only water source he has for irrigation. And so for him, it's really a rather question, well, I rather want to capture this excess water when it comes around once or twice every 10 years and make an economic loss during that year by potentially flooding every field that I have access to and putting the water underground. He can take that loss in that 1 year. He can buffer that quite easily with the crop production he makes from the other years. But yes, he has flooded grapes, wine grapes. He has flooded pistachios, alfalfa. He did not see any damage to his wine grapes, which he flooded well into June when they were leafed out. So, not really something we would typically recommend doing. A crop that is in active growth usually needs oxygen in the root zone in order to take up nutrients and water. So, and this is always the risk you run when you flood a crop with water during the active growing season, because as soon as you put the water on and it goes into the root zone, it provides a barrier to oxygen exchange. And so once you have cut the root zone off from the air, microbes in the soil will start consuming the residual oxygen that you have. You reach anoxic conditions, and then you run the risk that these anoxic conditions are damaging the root system to the extent that the plant is no longer able to function.
Mm. And how long, if you flood it, say 6 feet high, how long does the water take to
infiltrate?
Yeah.
Very much depends on the site. So soil texture, but the soil is usually only, soil surveys only look into the first 5 or 6 feet or so. But then we have other sediments deposited below, and we don't really have much information about exactly what the subsurface looks like. And again, sediments have been deposited by rivers, over thousands of years. Sometimes there might be a little bit of a clay layer in there, but that clay layer can have a big impact on the infiltration over, like a whole section, 10, 20 feet or so. So it's, yeah, it's often that we actually take soil cores at sites before we do flooding, over the first 30 feet to at least have an idea of, are there any surprises? Are there any larger clay lenses in the subsurface that we need to worry about? But because, again, we don't have much information on the subsurface, the state actually now, Department of Water Resources, has invested in these like airborne electromagnetic surveys. And then there's another technology, another geophysical technology that can actually be towed over fields. And so more and more, we are actually collecting information on where we might be able to find these coarse sediments in the subsurface that would be ideal for, recharge locations.
And so just to give a ballpark figure, so like on Don Cameron's farm, does it take within hours or days or weeks before the water?
So his water table is very deep. It's around 230 feet or so below land surface. So in the experiments that we have done, the amounts that we have applied wasn't even enough water to go down to the water table.
Okay.
But he has, I think in 2011 or so, he had a fairly large flood year where he could apply, I think he applied like almost 4,000 acre feet or so. And I think they did see a response in the water table, but that was weeks later. We've had other sites where the water table was only about 20 feet below land surface, and it took about 3 to 4 days to reach the water table. So yeah, I don't think there's a universal answer. It's all very site and location specific.
Cool. So when the water goes down in Don Cameron's land, how big is the underwater basin and aquifer? Does it go spread out to a really wide area, or does a lot of it stay underneath his land? Or where does the water go? And where is he too, by the way, exactly?
He's located near Helen, California, which is in the San Joaquin Valley, almost near the center line of the valley. So in the lowest topography area. And that would be an area where you typically see groundwater flowing towards that location from the rims, like from the edges of the basins, or like from the edges of the Central Valley. We have the Central Valley alluvial aquifer is actually divided into several so-called groundwater subbasins. Some of these basins are aligning with the watersheds, of the rivers that are flowing on top of them, where typically the river is actually the groundwater basin divide. So, because typically underneath a river, the water table would be going towards the river. And if we go further away from a river, we typically see the water table dropping, often because we're pumping in those locations. So that's like where groundwater depressions are forming. And, if the water table is lower over here and it's higher over here where we have the river flow, groundwater would be flowing from the higher elevation to the lower elevation. And those gradients in water table height are driving a lot how that water is actually moving. So let's say if I have, again, my river here, a groundwater depression here, and I'm doing recharge over here, it would temporarily form a groundwater mound that would then over time flatten out. And then eventually water would be following the regional gradient, whatever flow direction it has in the region, and potentially move some of that water out of your recharge location. But that is a process that takes months and years. So often the assumption we make is, well, if I'm recharging, let's say 2,000 acre feet in a month over this location, if I pump out 2,000 acre feet in the following growing season, there is very little chance that this water, or a substantial amount of that water that I recharged, has already left the region. There are the small losses, 10, 15, 20% potentially, but for the most part, we can, from a water balance perspective, say that we can account for that water under our feet that we just recharged 3 months ago.
So when Don floods his fields, so he'll have water for his neighbors too, and then it will actually flow into other regions too. So it should be helpful for the neighboring,
Yeah,
further
so
away the farms.
yes, and that is why he is part now of a larger recharge effort in that region, which is the McMullen Groundwater Sustainability Agency, as it is called. This is one of these entities that was formed in response to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that was passed in 2014. So overlying landowners had to form agencies that are now coming together to manage their groundwater basin. And so he formed one of these agencies with neighboring farmers and a nearby city, for example. And so I think they were covering over several thousand acres in land area, and they are now all coming together to invest into recharge programs. So not only his farm will receive flood water if there is any flood water, but other farmers too. And then everyone is signing a memorandum of understanding that this is a shared resource and can be jointly used by all the overlying landowners.
And how many farmers or areas in Central Valley do we need to recharge in order to make a significant difference in the groundwater, would you say?
Yeah, that is a good question. So most of the overdraft is happening in the southern Central Valley, so the area roughly from the Delta going down south to Bakersfield. This is where we have the so-called 21 critically overdrafted groundwater basins. Of the 160 million acre feet of overdraft over the entire Central Valley, about 70% of that overdraft is in the Tulare Lake Basin, which is the southern third of the Central Valley. So in that area, we have an annual overdraft of a good 2 to 4 million acre feet a year, based on historic data. And so based on some of the plans that have been submitted to address the overdraft, local entities are planning on addressing about 50% of that overdraft with recharge. We don't know if we have the surface water for that. Climate seems to be changing rather rapidly in California. We, just 10 years ago, we had a lot more precipitation than we have seen in the last 10 years. So it looks like we're going into an even drier period with less precipitation. So I think some of the estimates of how much, excess flow there might be available to use for recharge are probably overestimates. But I would say time will tell, and I think landowners really need to start thinking about fallowing. Fallowing is the only way of how you can really cut your overall water demand.
What's fallowing mean?
Fallowing means you just don't plant crops anymore on certain fields.
So if Don flooding his farm helps farmers in the region, like why is this so controversial? Like why are there a lot of people upset about it?
Well, because I think everyone is now looking at their imbalance in the water budget. So Don Cameron has landowners that are upslope from him. So somewhere between his locations and the mountains, there's many other water districts and farms, of course, that also would like to have some water to stay in business. So everyone is overdrafting a little bit. So everyone is now, of course, interested in closing the gap. And there are a couple of things that come together. So there are landowners that are affiliated with so-called surface water districts that have been formed a long time ago. Some of them have been older than 100 years. And California has a water rights system that says, particularly when you use surface water, if you are the first one in time, you got, one of the first water rights, you have a lot more power in using surface water than, folks that come in later. Let's say they might have gotten a water right in the 1960s. So whenever we don't have enough surface water, the state actually goes down the list and says, the youngest water rights holders do not get water first. And then we go down the list, and eventually, if there's really absolutely no surface water, even the oldest water rights holders would get no surface water allocation. So now imagine you already get your normal surface water supply cut because of climate change. Now, of course, you're looking for other sources of water, like these flood flows I've been talking about. And so everyone's applying for permits to get that water. But when you apply for that permit, there's a so-called open comment period where anyone can comment whether or not they have any objections to your application. And this is where it gets interesting. So there are interested parties that rather would like to see all the water go to their land, that don't want to see necessarily a drop of water go to their neighbor. And so it is a little bit a political conundrum that we have to navigate in order to get these recharge projects implemented. And unfortunately, instead of just taking a sort of joint approach, a community approach where we say we will all benefit if we recharge water, there is unfortunately some members that say, no, I want to hoard that water all for myself and I don't want to share it with anyone.
So yeah, so it seems like it's important to build some kind of cooperation amongst everyone.
Yeah,
a social aspect to it as well as a kind of
yes, very much.
Is it possible to recharge further up in the mountain so that the people high up a slope can get water too in the groundwater, or that's harder higher up?
Yeah, it definitely is a little bit higher up if you have slopes, so I mean, having a flat surface is just perfect to put the water on top and let it go into the subsurface. The Sierra Nevada mountains are definitely a big recharge area. We typically get recharge from snow-covered areas where you have a nice snowpack sitting on top. It melts at the bottom and water trickles into the ground. But overall, we actually don't really know much about how recharge is working in the mountains. And again, with climate change, we are unfortunately seeing some changes in those ecosystems that are not necessarily working in favor of recharge. So increasing temperatures have, for example, caused changes in vegetation in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So foothills typically dry out really quickly now. You see barely vegetation surviving over the summer because it doesn't rain for months, and soil moisture storage is quickly depleted going from spring into summer. But the rising temperatures also have the effect that you see more vegetation moving into higher elevations that are now all of a sudden needing water, and they never did before. At the same time, higher temperatures also mean more precipitation is falling as rain and not as snowpack or snow that actually stays on the surface for months and then it melts eventually. So, and that is again, this like flashiness of the system that we need to manage that is now all reliant on surface reservoirs. When the reservoirs were built 100 years ago, we had cooler temperatures and about 15 million acre feet of water were actually stored in the snowpack in the mountains. That was a big reservoir we didn't have to engineer. It was, just nature helping out. And then when snowmelt happens, you had that trickle flow going into reservoirs and then you could release it. Now with this shift to more precipitation and less snow, you get the runoff immediately. And you have to figure out, how am I going to manage all this flow that's coming down the mountain? Where am I going to put this? Where am I going to store this so I can use it later in the summer months? And because the runoff is happening so quickly, so it rains, and when we get these rainfall events, it rains for about 2 or 3 days and then it's over. So you don't have much time for that water to infiltrate into the soil to move to deeper groundwater, like mountain block recharge, as we call it. So it mainly runs off on the surface, collects in reservoirs and rivers, and we don't quite know how to store it.
Would improving the soil, because if soil has more organic content, it can hold a lot more water. Is that something that's useful?
Yeah, definitely in agricultural soils, we're fairly carbon depleted. That would definitely help with water holding capacity, probably help reducing irrigation amounts during the growing season. When it comes to our upland watersheds, I think managing vegetation is key. We just have too much forest in these watersheds. We haven't been thinning out our forests. There's a lot of trees. There's now beetle infestations. There is too many wildfires. Whenever you have a wildfire going through, you remove the vegetation that holds the soil in place, but you're also making, typically because of the high temperature fires we get, you make soils hydrophobic. And once they're hydrophobic, they're having a hard time infiltrating any water. So water that actually falls onto a burn scar onto the soil is repelled. It just sits on top and then flows again off instead of infiltrating into the soil. So there's a lot we actually need to do also in our upland watersheds to improve infiltration and reduce water demand so we can actually get more water yield from those watersheds.
Have you heard of those techniques in regenerative agriculture and permaculture where they do earthworks, like put rocks to slow down the water, and or do swales, like dig ditches?
Like check dams and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been, I think, some examples there. We have these mountain meadows that kind of do this naturally. So those are typically little sediment-filled depressions. Often they have a barrier at the outlet that sort of causes the ponding of the water behind it. Beavers are more and more in discussion on being helpful along those lines because they, built their own little dams. And that definitely helps with slowing down the water as it goes downhill and might induce more recharge in those areas too. So yeah, there are, some methods like that could be used.
Mm-hmm. And I did a podcast. I don't know if you heard of this research. I did a podcast with Francina Dominguez. She's a hydroclimatologist. She was looking at groundwater and rain. She was saying in her model, she found that the vegetation would bring up the groundwater through its roots and actually would create more evapotranspiration. So that would create more rain downwind. And so the groundwater is actually an important part in plays a role in creating the rain. And so so possibly in California, as you deplete the groundwater, it's actually going to affect the rain. Or I don't know if you've heard of that research along those lines.
Yeah, not that specific study, but yes, in areas where you do have shallow groundwater, and we use that principle also for crop production. The Scott River Valley in Northern California in Siskiyou County, for example, makes use of shallow groundwater when they grow alfalfa, because alfalfa has very deep roots. It can go up to 2 meters into the subsurface. So if some of those roots are tapping the shallow groundwater, you have to irrigate less because they are taking water, from that groundwater table. I'm not sure that I've seen necessarily estimates on, crop water uptake of groundwater and then having a local climatological effect that might increase precipitation. But I think David Heinemann has shown that the entire irrigated area that we have over the High Plains aquifer, it does have implications for climate, that is, climate patterns that are moving towards the east. So if you have a large irrigated area, which is, actively transpiring water, you are increasing the moisture of the atmosphere over that area. And that moisture, of course, is going to be, moved somewhere else and then might fall as precipitation. So there have been reports. I think for California, we're really on the other end of the spectrum. We just didn't really have enough precipitation in the last couple of years. So soil moisture storage is very much depleted, and even moisture in our natural vegetation is at really historically low levels. I don't think we have seen such dry vegetation in over 100 years or even ever. And that is really, the risk now for wildfires. Vegetation is bone dry. You just have to light a match and it will all start burning. So there's no more natural resistance to some of these, wildfire risks just because biomass is so dry.
Yeah, one of the ways that it could possibly keep more moist is if we did have more groundwater, right? Have you heard of something called hydraulic redistribution, where the tree roots are bringing up the groundwater and kind of hydrating the whole environment? So
yeah, but you still need a somewhat shallow enough water table in order to have that gradient happen. So I mean, again, in Central Valley, if your water table is 200 feet below land surface, no active section of a plant will bring that water table up.
well, you said like in the 1800s or something, we had groundwater tables that were so shallow that there was artisanal things. So
yeah,
was that possibly that back then that the fires were a lot less because there was a lot more groundwater accessible for the vegetation, possibly?
yeah, that could probably be. Although, fire is part of our system. So and if you ask, some of the tribal communities that have been living in this space before settlers came in, they will report that fires are a natural process that is also helping with the thinning of the forest and ecosystem. So I think it just needs to be a combination of many things, like not just, let's say, restoring the water table is not easy. We would need a major surplus in water in order to make this happen. And I'm not sure that we have that surplus at the moment.
Yeah. Well, in terms of fires, like I think there is a difference between cool fires and hot fires, right? The hot fires actually create this hydrophobic soil. So
Yeah.
if the land was more hydrated, perhaps you'd have more cooler fires, so you wouldn't have this problem with the soils turning hydrophobic.
Yeah, and this is what they are trying to do with the controlled fires. So if you do controlled burning in selected seasons where you definitely know there will be rain coming in about 2 weeks or so, then your risk of having this fire get out of control would be much lower. And these controlled burning events, typically you are just interested in burning the ground vegetation, like grasses, bushes, near the ground surface, but all the tall trees that are making up the forest, for example, would be would be untouched in the process. So now with these hot fires, I mean, they are creating their own fire tornadoes, for example. You're burning everything. It's just a complete loss. And then that, of course, will affect the recovery of the ecosystem. So yes, some species need fire in order to open, for example, the seed pods that will release the seeds for the next generation. But often what we want is like having a couple mature trees left that can then drop seeds, and then from that you would get regrowth. And if you have a complete destruction of your vegetation ecosystem, then you have to actually go in and replant, for example, manually.
And you say that well, with the rainfall and the droughts right now, like it seems like the rainfall is coming in more big bursts, right? I think in California, like the atmospheric rivers, the big rainfalls account for almost half of California's water.
Yeah, that's right.
So is there a way to capture, like, is that half of that, when those big rains come, is that all stored in the reservoir, or does a lot of it leak out to the ocean, or what happens when those big rains come usually?
Yeah, when these big atmospheric rivers come, first of all, they are not typically covering the entire state when that happens. They are fairly narrow bands. They're around 400 or 500 kilometers wide. So then one might hit Northern California or Southern California, and you do get quite a bit of precipitation. We had one last year in October, which was a Category 5 atmospheric river, which is the highest category, meaning high winds and lots of precipitation. I think the Coast Range in some areas got 16 inches of precipitation in one day, which is a lot of water. 16 inches, that's almost 1.5 feet of water. And that will immediately cause flooding, and you barely have any really chance to capture that water. I mean, again, remember that most of the reservoirs are in the Sierra Nevada, and we don't have many in the Coast Range, for example. So for those areas, rainfall becomes runoff, it goes out to the ocean. There's not much you can do to hold it back.
I mean, is that a good idea for us to somehow, is it even possible to reclaim some of our floodplains or something so that we have these more natural, like it used to be, so that we could capture the atmospheric rivers when they come?
Yeah, that's definitely a good idea. And some areas have thought about putting or like setting these levees back to open the river to a larger floodplain, which would allow, the river to spread the flood wave to spread over large area, which typically helps capping the peak. So instead of getting a very steep hydrograph, you basically reduce the peak flow and you spread out your flood wave, which helps with downstream areas not hopefully being overwhelmed by that flood water. It also creates more groundwater recharge. It creates habitat for aquatic species that need access to the floodplain for spawning, for food, etc. So there are many ecological benefits that opening up the floodplain would definitely provide. It's just a matter of figuring out how and where it is safe to do so.
Right. And yeah, I mean, and yeah, so if it helps with the floods and it helps with groundwater, and maybe it helps with, I mean, if it creates more evapotranspiration, maybe more rain, and maybe if it helps with the fires, I think maybe some research needs to be done on that. Like if you create more water stored in these wetlands, maybe that you have more humid winds and like, because there is a big problem in California right now, the huge fires and like if we could somehow retain more water on the continent, maybe that would help with fighting the fires.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the benefits of wetlands, I think Hurricane Ian, there was an area that was flooded by Hurricane Ian, and they had actually put quite a bit of effort into restoring the coastal wetland surrounding the community. And I think now there's reports coming out that they had very little damage to the community. They didn't have flooding, and the coastal wetland did what it's supposed to be doing, buffering against the ocean. So that is exactly the function or the benefits that some of these ecosystems provide. We just keep forgetting about them, and we just sometimes love to engineer our way in and out of everything. And it's maybe not recommended to always go to an engineering approach, but perhaps watch and listen to what nature has done in the past and maybe restore some of those functionalities, because they worked in that space, in that particular location.
Yeah, I think there's a movement now called nature-based solutions, and it's also work. I mean, there's a whole complexity and systems thinking movement too, and I think water is actually so multidimensional, and like the way we normally do it with the levees and the dams and all these man-made things, we don't understand the full complexity of the water cycle. So we're not, and so I think as we begin to understand how it all ties together, maybe we'll start seeing that it's actually a better solution to use some of these natural solutions.
Yeah.
Maybe the civil engineering, I mean, all the people that go into hydrology, maybe they could, yeah, I think, in some of the hydrology and civil engineering, it's a lot focused on, I guess, what they call gray infrastructure. Maybe they could learn how the green infrastructure, the nature-based solutions can work too, would be helpful.
Yeah, I think, any civil engineer that's going into a civil engineering program, maybe you want to take a couple classes in ecology, biology, geomorphology, or maybe just like some hydrologic sciences classes, not hydrologic engineering classes. I think we can learn a lot from just looking a little bit at our neighboring disciplines and see, or learn about, okay, how is the system actually working without humans being present? Because that's often, how we started, and then we, humans have changed the system, and then changed it not necessarily always in the way that nature supported in the beginning. So I think there's definitely a lot to learn by taking a multidisciplinary approach.
And so how does it work for someone in academia like you? Like, are there people, do you see movements that bridging the people who are working in kind of your area that's seeing the nature things bridging with the civil engineers, or is there that kind of movement happening right now?
Yeah, I think so. Not sure necessarily, particularly with engineers, but in our program, for example, we do work a lot with the engineers and the California Department of Water Resources. So that is a state agency that is tasked with managing water resources in the state. And they collaborate quite a bit with various researchers, climatologists, geomorphologists, like, even fish biologists, to understand, for example, what is it that a fish needs in a river. So what do we need to change in how we manage our reservoirs, for example, to mimic flows in the downstream channel that are, providing adequate habitat for certain fish species that we have in those rivers. So I think there's definitely a lot of learning. There's also a growing interest in incorporating tribal knowledge, because again, some of these tribes have had, century-long experience in managing or like living in harmony with these ecosystems. And it's not always, the modern way that we apply right now that is potentially the best one to use.
So there is some recognition in academia that some of the indigenous ways are good.
Yeah.
And is California generally more progressive than other states or other countries, or is it lagging behind, or how would it compare, would you say?
Yeah, it's that's a good question. I think there's always room to learn. There's definitely some things I think we're pretty good at in terms of water management. I think we have one of the most sophisticated infrastructure systems in the world to move water over several hundreds of miles from Northern California all the way to Los Angeles. But some of that infrastructure is crumbling now and is not necessarily fit to manage some of the changes that we have in climate. And there's things we can learn from our neighboring states. So I was just coming back from a conference on groundwater sustainability, and for example, our neighboring, well, not necessarily neighboring, but one of the states in the United States, Kansas, has been monitoring groundwater pumping since the 1990s. We don't do that in California, but yet having that information would actually help a lot with managing groundwater. So right now, we have given sort of restrictions or guidelines on, okay, this is where you need to go in terms of groundwater use over the next 20 years. But we're not really measuring the pulse. We're measuring it indirectly by monitoring groundwater levels, but we could take a much more aggressive or forward-thinking approach. I mean, it's about accountability. There is always going to be people that will not comply, and they go uncovered right now, right? So, and then other people will have to make up for their water use, because in the end, every overlying landowner over a groundwater basin, if they don't meet the milestones, if they don't go to where they get to where they need to go, will be penalized in some way. So yeah, I think that was interesting to know. Also, state of Nebraska, for example, has an interesting groundwater market going on. California is in the process of developing groundwater markets, but we still try to figure out how all of this could work, how it is going to be equitable, how we can avoid misuse of marketing principles or groundwater trading principles. And so I think sometimes we need to look beyond our borders and learn from others.
And do you have any insights in some other countries too, like Australia and Pakistan just recently both had huge floods this year? Like, would some of these nature-based solutions have helped there? Like allowing the floodplains to capture the water, and would it also restore the groundwater in those places?
Well, I would say Pakistan is not a very engineered state.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at their carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emission contributions to the world, it's minuscule compared to what China and US is putting out every year. So unfortunately, Pakistan is an example that has been hit hard by climate change. Basically, it's bad luck for them. And not sure that, you know, groundwater recharge or any of the methods we're using here in California would have necessarily helped them. The amount of precipitation that they received within a short period of time and the stream flow, plus, you know, some of the snow melt, glacier melt that's happening in the higher mountains surrounding that you know, low plain area that was flooded, and I think a quarter or so of that area was underwater for several weeks, you know. That is not something we can prepare for. And this is exactly the risk that we're running more and more into with climate change. This, like, again, acceleration of the hydrologic cycle. Sometimes you have areas that never will see a drop of water again. And then there's areas that will see multiple rainfall events, like Kentucky. I think we had like 3 1,000-year events this year in Kentucky. 1,000 year. That means a return period of an event of such a magnitude that should, on average, only happen once every 1,000 years. So I think people need to learn that, you know, these events are all related to climate, like what we do with our climate, with the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to cut down on those if we want to potentially bring patterns back into, you know, into boundaries of where they were 50, 100 years ago.
Right, yeah. And in those areas where they are getting a lot of rainfall and they have a groundwater depletion, maybe there's ways to kind of guide some of the excess water into the groundwater, like if we...
Yeah, I mean, again, groundwater is, it's a slow system. It's not as fast moving or responsive as our surface water system. So, I mean, when it rains, a river will swell, you'll see an increase in flow, and then eventually will subside again. Groundwater is not working at that time scale. You can't easily fit a flood wave into a groundwater system unless you have, you know, huge areas of gravel that can take and absorb that water. So this is the mismatch in time scale. And unfortunately, again, with climate change, these events are going to become, these flood events are going to become more like higher, more intense in magnitude, meaning even more water in a unit of time. And that's going to make it even more difficult to manage that. So yes, you will see more flooding. Some of that water definitely will go into groundwater. We can see if we can manage these flood flows with reservoirs, hold them back, and then release them so we can put more groundwater underground. But often you want to have controlled flooding to really facilitate good groundwater recharge. And I'm not sure we're going to get controlled flooding
Right.
in some areas.
I mean, if we set aside more of our floodplains so that there's more natural wetlands too, maybe that's a solution. Like,
yeah, but then, you know, rivers, coastal areas are prime areas for, you know, urban development. I mean, everyone wants to have a river view. Everyone likes to be next to a river because, you know, we've used traditionally the water for drinking water supply or navigation or whatever it is. So a lot would have to also change to really free those lands, you know, which often means like either you have to buy it back, which is expensive, or yeah, we will, you know, we'll have to think about how we want to live with nature.
yeah, I guess, yeah, it's a difficult thing to kind of return those lands, but the problem is getting bigger and bigger. Like, I think in the Netherlands, they did decide to buy back land and turn it into floodplains, and in China too, because sponge cities because the floods were just getting too big. So they moved people from the floodplains so that the floodplains could absorb the floods.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess it's difficult because we want to live near the rivers and stuff. Cool. So what's on the horizon for you? Like, what's your next steps in your research and progress?
Yeah, we have several research sites underway where we are studying in more detail, you know, some of the processes. So, for example, flooding farm fields with excess water. You know, you put typically fertilizer on farm fields if you want to grow crops. So there is risk of nitrate leaching, for example, to groundwater, which is not something we would like to see in groundwater if we use that water as a drinking water supply. But we are also working on larger picture questions. So, for example, you know, how can we convince more stakeholders here to actually buy into this on-farm recharge program? I'm working with researchers from other states to see if this is also a technology we can apply in other states of the United States or even abroad. Israel, for example, we have a research collaboration going on. So there's, you know, I think the fact that groundwater reserves are increasingly depleted, no matter where you look in the world. The United States is not the only country who has that issue. Australia, Europe, Africa, you know, Middle East, all of India, big issues with groundwater overdraft. All of these regions could probably benefit from more research on how we can intentionally put more water into groundwater aquifers. So we're trying to basically work with other researchers in that space to see how we can make that happen.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for doing that work. And yeah, thank you also for this interview. Really appreciate all your insights.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.